The Cold War is a long period of American history that most people only know the highlights of, especially the millennials. But some of the older crowd may have forgotten or even been told some misinformation about it. So today, let's go ahead and... Wait, I have something for this. Привет! Говорите о холодной войне, вы должны начать с Первой мировой войны. Пожалуйста, простите мой плохой акцент. Это было много лет с тех пор я научился говорить по-русски. It is way too hot to be wearing this in July. What was I thinking? So like I was saying, you can't start talking about the Cold War without first talking about World War I. However, since I can't cover literally 100 years of history in one video and do it all justice, I'm going to leave most of the wars out for their own video, if not multiple. Here I'm just going to focus directly on the parts that affect the Cold War and politics. I promise it's not going to be as boring as it sounds. Dude, come on, it's your video. Oh, yeah, sorry, my bad. You were saying? Let's start in 1917. Germany and the Central Powers were holding their own, if not winning the war. But they wanted to secure that victory by knocking out two of the major powers without fighting at all. One of these turned out to be a major mistake immediately, and the other turned out to be a major mistake a few decades later. At the time, America was super isolationist and wanted nothing to do with the war, except to sell weapons and make loads of money, something we still excel at today, by the way. But Germany wanted to make sure we stayed out of the war in Europe by politely asking Mexico to start a war here. They did this by telegram, which was predictably intercepted by the British and made public. This is known as the Zimmermann telegram. This didn't exactly make Americans too happy, and combined with the sinking of several merchant ships like the Lusitania, which was also carrying weapons, was enough to shift public opinion to make America finally join the war. On the other front, Germany wanted to get Russia out of the war. They did this by sending several political revolutionaries into Russia to start a coup. One of these people was Vladimir Lenin. He successfully overthrew the Tsar, slaughtered his entire family, and founded the Soviet Union, and then made peace with Germany. Long story short, Germany and the Central Powers lost. But back in the day when you lost a war, you not only lost militarily, you lost in every way possible. It's like being mugged in an alley. And not only do they take your wallet and break a few ribs, but they also take your job, your car, and maybe even one or two of your kids. The harsh economic sanctions put on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles were the direct cause of Hitler's rise to power. So then World War II happened. Hitler didn't want to make the same mistakes as last time, so he kept a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. He even tried to get Stalin to join the Axis powers in 1940, but that didn't work out, so a year later, Germany invaded. This time though, the United States wanted nothing to do with the war. Hitler was Europe's problem. This is a very underreported aspect of world history, but on the other side of the world in 1937, Japan conducted what was called the Rape of Nanking, where they literally slaughtered and raped an entire city. I promise this is going to be a video topic in itself, but if you can't wait, the book by Chang does an excellent job reporting on this story. America knew about this atrocity and the mass genocide of the Chinese and the Koreans, but instead of getting directly involved, we decided to cut off their supply of oil. In response to this, Japan decided it needed to take over all of the oil-rich islands in the Pacific. But in order to do that, they first needed to take out the US Navy, so they bombed Pearl Harbor. While Pearl Harbor is the place we all know about, the Day of Infamy was actually a well-timed worldwide attack. Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, Midway, and dozens of other US territories were all attacked simultaneously. So of course, the United States declared war on Japan. And since Japan and Germany were allies, Germany declared war on us. So we declared war on Germany. And ta-da! World War II. It's important to remember that the United States did not join the war in order to stop Hitler from killing the Jews. We, and the world as a whole, did not really know that that was happening until we got there. We did know what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese, though, and our response to that, followed by their response to our response, is what got us into the war. The US and the Soviet Union took on two very different strategies when it came to the war. The US took on more of a technological approach, doing new things like high-altitude precision night bombings, while the Soviets took on more of a brute strength approach, just throwing bodies at a city until the Germans couldn't take it anymore. Anyway, once the Soviet Union and the US were involved, it was pretty clear that the Germans were going to lose again, so the Allies were already concerning themselves with what post-war Europe was going to look like. FDR's approach was called the Marshall Plan. Instead of imposing the same economic sanctions that started World War II, the US would help rebuild the countries that were defeated. Not only would we physically rebuild, but we would also help institute new democratic governments based on socialist ideas. FDR had already started instituting those plans here in the United States with the New Deal. Had he not died before the end of the war, we very well may have looked more like France or Germany does today. The Soviets' plan was based much more on intimidation and control. At the end of the war, Europe was divided in half, the West being NATO and the East being the Warsaw Pact. In fact, the entire world quickly had to choose sides. The US, NATO, and its allies became known as the First World. The Soviets and its allies were the Second World, and anyone else became known as the Third World. This is the actual origin of the phrase Third World. It has very little to do with the economic development of the country, although that did tend to line up sometimes. It's important to remember that neutral countries like Switzerland were technically Third World. But nowhere was this division more apparent than in Germany. Not only was Germany divided into East and West, but Berlin, which resided entirely within East Germany, was also divided into East and West. East Germans were not allowed to cross into West Germany, but there was a loophole. To escape the oppression of the Soviets, East Germans could go to Berlin, where they could safely cross into West Berlin and then to West Germany. The Soviets decided to close this loophole in 1961 by building the Berlin Wall. Famously, during construction, an East German soldier named Konrad Schumann abandoned his post and jumped the fence. The Berlin Wall was not constructed to keep West Berliners out, but to keep East Berliners in, and stood for several decades as a symbol of the Cold War. But let's move on to another country that was divided after the war. During the liberation of Korea, the Soviets came in from the north and the US from the south. They decided to keep the two Koreas separated along the 38th parallel and just wait to decide what to do about reunification later. But in 1950, the Soviet and Chinese back north got tired of waiting and decided to invade. The US and the Soviet Union both had nuclear weapons at this point, but we didn't want to use them, so we didn't go to war. It was just a little conflict, you know, a little schoolyard tussle. It cost a few million lives, but you know, boys will be boys. The war lasted until 1953 when a ceasefire was finally declared, but the line was basically at the 38th parallel again, although now it's ironically called the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. I say ironically because it's basically the most dangerous game of Frogger ever, with more landmines, barbed wire, and pre-aimed artillery pointed at it than anywhere else on Earth. Technically, the war is still ongoing, and occasionally the North and South exchange a few shots. This was also the beginning of the Red Scare in the United States. Under Senator McCarthy, a witch hunt was started for anyone who might be communist, and anyone who held even the slightest socialist view was labeled as un-American. President Truman would later call this a mockery of the Bill of Rights. During no time in history was holding a different political view seen as anti-American. America was built on differing political views. We had to be completely different from the Soviets in every way. If the Soviets were communists, we were capitalists. If the Soviets were red, we were blue. If the Soviets were atheists, we were Christian. In 1954, Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Unlike what many Americans believe, this was not always part of the pledge, and it was just as controversial back then as it is today. Many argued that this was a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and they made the same argument again 2 years later when the national motto was changed from E Pluribus Unum to In God We Trust. In 1957, that phrase started appearing on all of our paper money. The Red Scare also made us look at our defensive vulnerabilities. One of the major ones was our transportation network. In 1956, it took 62 days to cross the country by car on highways like this. So taking inspiration from the German Autobahn system, President Eisenhower proposed the Interstate Highway, officially known as the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. This is the answer to the age-old joke of why there are interstates in Hawaii. The interstates connect military bases, not states or cities. Those are just an added benefit. An unfortunate side effect of the interstates are towns like this one. Bypassed in the name of efficiency, hundreds of towns saw the same fate as Radiator Springs and were left completely abandoned. Now you could get across the country in only 4 days. Unfortunately, getting from one side of the country to the other wasn't the only destination we were worried about getting to quickly. During this time, the space race was kicking off, almost entirely out of nuclear fears. The US and the Soviet Union seemed to be in competition to see who could blow up the world the most times, and in 1957 it was pretty clear that the Soviets were winning when they launched Sputnik. This meant that instead of a missile maybe having a range of 10,000 miles, it could reach basically anywhere on Earth. This scared the bejesus out of Americans. Luckily, we had a foolproof method of protecting ourselves from nuclear fallout.
He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn.
The Soviets followed up Sputnik with Laika. In the ultimate rags to riches story, she was just a stray street mutt from Moscow who was selected to become the first animal in space. The Soviets said that she was euthanized on day 6 before her oxygen tank had run out. But in 2002, the truth came out that she actually died an extremely painful death from overheating just hours into the mission. The first human in space was also a Soviet accomplishment, Yuri Gagarin in 1961. But gee golly, the Americans were just 3 weeks behind with Alan Shepard. Throughout all of this, the looming threat of nuclear missiles pervaded everyday life. But no more so than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union tried to park a few dozen ICBMs just 90 miles off of the Florida coast. This was enough for many Americans to start construction of their own personal backyard vaults. The Soviets backed off their plans when the US agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey, but this was not the only time the US was faced with near nuclear disaster. Just a few years earlier, we nearly bombed ourselves into oblivion when we had a B-52 on air alert. Air alert was when we had B-52 bombers flying around loaded with nuclear weapons ready to go at a moment's notice. In 1961, one of these B-52s crashed outside of Greensboro, North Carolina, carrying 2 nuclear weapons. They ejected both of the weapons, but one of their parachutes didn't properly deploy, causing it to hit the ground at terminal velocity. When it was recovered, it was found that the impact had actually armed the weapon. If you'd like to know more about near disasters like this, or the American nuclear program in general, I recommend Eric Schlosser's book, Command and Control. But the space race continued, with the ultimate goal being the moon. Why? Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to say, correctly, that the space race was caused by nuclear fears, but he also likes to say that it was a race for the high ground. I personally find this argument a little difficult to grasp. If you were to place the fastest ICBM that we have, the Minuteman III, on the moon, it would take nearly 16 hours for it to reach its target on Earth. The same ICBM launched from Cuba would only take 15 minutes to reach New York. So the high ground argument doesn't make much sense to me. What about the conspiracy theory mentioned by Interstellar that going to the moon was just a way to bankrupt the Soviet Union? If that was the plan, it failed miserably. The Soviet Union didn't go bankrupt for several decades after the space race was over. If we were going to fake it, why would we stop before the Soviets went bankrupt? And why would we fake it 6 more times, including one where the mission failed and we almost killed the entire crew? But gee willikers, we sure did get to the moon, so we won the space race. This is what happens to people when they try to tell Buzz Aldrin that he didn't actually do it.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Elsewhere in the world, former colonies were finally getting their independence, and once they were independent, their fates of joining either the First or the Second World were quickly called into question. Most famous of these was Vietnam. After French Indochina got its independence in 1954 after a brutal war, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia all quickly switched to communism with the help of the Chinese and the Soviets. The US helped South Vietnam stay democratic by splitting the country in 2 along the 17th parallel. You know, because that worked out so well last time. Again, out of fear of nuclear weapons, we didn't go to total war. It was just another little conflict. The draft, though, yeah, we'll go ahead and use that, and if you're against it, you're anti-American. Along with helping the North Vietnamese, the Soviets aided a guerrilla warfare group known as the Viet Cong. This help greatly increased in 1965 when President Johnson finally escalated the conflict, by dedicating land forces to the cause. The Viet Cong and their guerrilla tactics were a major reason why American support for the South slowly dwindled, and all American forces were finally withdrawn in 1973. During the 70s and the 80s, the Americans and the Soviets were backing democratic or communist coups in dozens of countries. Here's a map of the world in 1980. The US and its allies are in blue, and the Soviets and its allies are in red, and the Third World is in gray. All of those X's are where some form of armed conflict or coup is taking place. As you can see, the CIA and the KGB were pretty active during this time. An often forgotten conflict, at least by the Americans, is often referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In 1979, the communist government of Afghanistan asked for direct military aid from the Soviet Union. The Soviets agreed and invaded. And much like what the Soviets did with the Viet Cong, the United States aided its own guerrilla group, the Mujahideen. Wait, why does that sound so familiar? Oh yeah, whoops. Mujahideen means one engaged in jihad in Arabic. Yeah, we started that. In fact, we were so proud of starting it that Rambo 3 takes place in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War. If you saw the movie before 9/11, this is the dedication at the end. Of course, after 9/11, for the DVD release, they changed it to this. Why? Because in 1989, when the Soviets finally gave up and withdrew, the Mujahideen lost its support from the US and began fighting itself. The group that would end up on top? The Taliban. The group that would eventually help Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden fly some planes into our buildings 12 years later. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was one of the first signs of the dwindling power of the Soviet Union. Republics were breaking away, anti-communist movements were gaining momentum, and the Soviet economy had all but collapsed. But the biggest sign of the end of the Cold War was the fall of the Berlin Wall. President Reagan uttered this line in 1987.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The wall didn't start to come down until the end of 1989. 1 month after the fall of the wall, Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush Sr. all said that the Cold War was finally over. Germany was reunified just under a year later, and the Soviet Union officially dissolved in Christmas of 1991. But in order to leave the Soviet Union, any former Soviet state was required to turn over its nuclear arsenal to Russia. So there you have it, everyone lived happily ever after. There are a few lessons to be learned here though. The more you try to keep a country out of your war, the more likely they are to end up all up in your business. And if you send a group to secretly undermine or overthrow the government you're currently fighting, you may end up fighting that group 20 years later, like Lenin in Russia or the Taliban in Afghanistan. They say that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So the next time your military commanders come to you with an awesome plan for a coup or think it would be a good idea to start a land war in Russia, hopefully you'll know better. In Soviet Russia, subscriptions ask for you. No, but seriously, if you like this video or you learned something, go ahead and give that like button a click. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, I put out new videos every weekend, so go ahead and give that subscribe button a tickle. But if you're like me and you like to see 2 or 3 videos of someone before you commit, how about this one?